We're doing another one of these periodic sermon series where Malcolm preaches about a topic for a while. And today, the broad topic is our spiritual reality. And today we're going to focus on this story of the rich man and Lazarus because it's one of the best stories in the Old and New Testaments for understanding some basic fundamental ideas about our spiritual reality. For example, it's one of the few stories that has heaven and hell and a place in between it. And it's also a kind of uncomfortable story. There's a man that goes to hell in the story, and he's tormented there. And it seems that he ends up in hell because he has an abundance of wealth and food and is unwilling to share it with the poor man at his gate. How many of us have more than enough food and money, while there are still plenty of people in the world who do not have enough? The goal is not to make you feel uncomfortable, but if we just talked about the interesting spiritual ideas in the parable and did not grapple with the uncomfortable parts, that wouldn't feel like a fair treatment of the story. So we're going to feel some uncomfortability today. You can enjoy it. We're going to go through the parable, and as we do, I invite you to keep 3 questions in mind, and we'll sort of see answers to them at various points as we go along. The first question is this question of what is our spiritual reality? How are things set up? Why are they set up that way? It isn't the full focus of today, but we'll learn a few things as we go along. The second question is, how can we know about our spiritual reality? How can we learn more about heaven and hell and what comes in between? And we're going to take this parable as a kind of test case, a chance to look at something from the literal sense and see how do we work with this to gain more information. And the third question is, what do we then do with this knowledge? The story makes it clear that it's not enough just to have it for ourselves. We need to grapple with what is our responsibility once we have been given this gift of knowledge of our spiritual reality. So you can keep those questions vaguely in mind as we go through the story. The first part of the story is the rich man. He was rich, he wore crimson and fine linen, and he made merry every day in a splendid manner. Another translation says that he fared sumptuously every day. And one other one says he entertained himself magnificently. Either way, you get the point. And the teachings of the new church help us to understand that this is all about people who have the benefit of the word. One passage says that the crimson and fine linen that he wore symbolized the word's goodness and truth. Crimson, its goodness, and fine linen, its truth. And the man making merry every day in a splendid manner means the Jews, who were the people who had the privilege of having the word at that time when the Lord came into the world, those people taking pleasure in possessing the word and reading it, and in hearing many things from it in their temples and synagogues. This is us, guys. We have what the Jews had, the Old Testament, and we also have the New Testament, and we also have all the books of the teachings of the new church. We have such an abundance of spiritual wealth and spiritual food. We fare sumptuously all the time. In some ways, we're doing that right now. As we hear from the Lord's word and discuss it afterward, we get to have a feast and thank the Lord for that feast. Without the Lord's word, we would be like Lazarus begging for crumbs. That's what our first lesson from the teachings of the new church said. Without the word, no one would have any knowledge of God, of heaven and hell, of life after death, and still less of the Lord. So this is the first and obvious answer to the question, how can we know about spiritual reality? From the Lord in his word. He made this natural reality and the spiritual reality that we live in, and he reveals it to us in his word. By the word of Jehovah, the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. And when we know what it is that makes us spiritually rich, it's having the Lord's word, it's clear that it's not a bad thing to be spiritually rich. It's not a bad thing to be spiritually clothed in nice clothes. It's not a bad thing to be spiritually well-fed. The Lord wants that for all of his people. In one of his letters at the beginning of the book of Revelation, he says to some people, I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white garments, that you may be clothed. And in the Psalms, we read that the Lord opens his hand and satisfies the desire of every living thing. The Lord wants us to have spiritual food and spiritual clothing and even spiritual riches. The issue is, what do we do with it once we have it? Are we willing to share it with other people? So now let's talk about the poor man, Lazarus. He was laid at the rich man's gate, covered in sores, and longing to be satisfied from the crumbs which fell from the table of the rich man. And the teachings of the new church tell us that Lazarus means people who did not have the word and who, when the Lord was on earth, were despised and rejected by the Jews. These people, because they did not have access to the truth, were plagued by many false notions, one passage says. And that's symbolized in the parable by Lazarus being full of sores. When we don't have the truth, our lives can be unhealthy. They can be plagued by diseases. And the dogs that came and licked his sores mean good people outside of the church who want to help and try to help in the best ways they can, like a dog dutifully, lovingly licking someone's sores, but it doesn't do as much good as the person really needs because they're lacking the truths of faith. Another passage tells us that these people who are lacking the truth, deprived of the opportunity to read and understand the word, because they long for the truth, that's why it says that Lazarus longed to be satisfied from the crumbs which fell from the table of the rich man. To bring this together, let's think of a basic example. Imagine a young woman outside the church who has a family member die suddenly. She's dealing with the shock and the grief of that loss, but she's also really hurting because she doesn't know if she'll ever see that loved one again. Her friends might come and try to offer her support by saying things like, I'm sure they're in a better place, or the memory of them will live on in you. But that's kind of like the dogs licking the sores. The dogs love the person, they're trying to help, but it's not the same. Imagine if instead that young woman could have some food from the rich man's table, some oil, some wine, some medicine, some bandages for her sores. Imagine she could hear about the vision of heaven and the spiritual world revealed in the teachings of the new church. We can see Lazarus and people outside there in the world, and we can also see Lazarus in the world within us. When we're talking about how the Lord, through his word, can reveal spiritual reality to us, it's also this. It's also how he can reveal our spiritual states to us, provide a mirror to understand what's going on inside us. He can help us to see the poor, ignorant, sore-ridden beggar within us. And he can also help us to see the self-centered, greedy, stingy rich man within us. These are both part of our spiritual reality, and the Lord can help us to see both of them within us and many, many other characters too. It's also worth reflecting on the significance of Lazarus being laid at the rich man's gate. We don't know how Lazarus came to be there, but the fact of the matter was he was at that particular rich man's gate. And the rich man, rich though he was, certainly did not have enough food to feed all the poor people in the world. And maybe he didn't even have enough food to feed all the people in his town. But he certainly did have enough food to feed Lazarus, or at least give him some crumbs from his table. It can be overwhelming to think of all the poor and suffering people in the world. And we don't have the resources individually to help all of them. But can we help the person on our gate? Wise people who I've talked to say that the Lord seems to put certain people in our path for us to help. We can't help everyone, but maybe we can try to help the person in front of us. What does that mean for your life? I don't know. At this stage of your life, it might be just showing up in a generous way for your spouse and your children, or for the people that you work with, or for your immediate neighbors, the people who physically live close to you. Maybe they could use some of your generosity. Or maybe you're at a stage in your life where the Lord would like you to stretch a bit further to more people in need. I recommend taking some time to pray about it and ask the Lord genuinely, who do you want me to reach out to, Lord? Who is at my gate? One final way of looking at the significance of the sore-ridden beggar who finds his way to our gates is the poor and hurting parts that we find within ourselves. We might not have chosen to have that particular character flaw or that particular hurt from our past or those particular issues to deal with, and yet there they are on the doorsteps of our heart. We have a responsibility to feed them and try to nurse them back to health. Now, in the parable, Lazarus eventually dies and is carried by the angels into Abraham's bosom, and the rich man ends up tormented in flames in hell. And this highlights the challenges of using the Lord's word to understand spiritual reality. How much of that description are we meant to take literally? To take this is how it is in the spiritual world? Well, here we're very lucky to have the teachings of the New Church, which are actually very blunt on this particular story. One passage says this: "In this parable, as in others, the Lord spoke by correspondences. The rich man does not mean the rich, nor does Abraham mean Abraham, nor does the flame mean flame, for in hell no one is tortured by flames." And another passage helps us to understand how the pieces of stories, in the literal sense, can serve as containers for the reality of the situation. This is pretty long, but so good, so we're going to read it at length a bit. This is from the book True Christian Religion, number 215. "The truths in the literal sense of the word are in part not bare truths, but appearances of truth. They are like similes and comparative analogies taken from appearances in the natural world. Thus, they are adapted and brought down to the level at which they may be understood by simple people and even children. But because they are at the same time correspondences, they serve to receive and make a home for genuine truth. They are containers in the sense that a crystal cup is a container of vintage wine. People who possess divine truths and believe that the word inwardly in its depths is something holy and divine, and more so those who believe that the word is like this because of its spiritual and celestial senses, these people, that can be us, when they read the word and receive enlightenment from the Lord, see divine truths by natural light. For the light of heaven, which illuminates the spiritual sense of the word, exerts an influence on the natural light which illuminates its literal sense, and enlightens a person's intellectual faculty, enabling it to see and recognize divine truths, whether plain to view or hidden. The light of heaven has this effect upon people, sometimes even without their knowing it." So in this story, we have these natural comparisons, these correspondential images about spiritual reality. We have heaven described as being in Abraham's bosom, and hell being described as being in torments and flame, and a great chasm or gulf between them. And the teachings of the New Church explain that people in heaven are not literally all lying on Abraham's chest, and people in hell are not burning in literal flames, but there is a heaven, there is a place of love and connection and warmth and safety, and there is a hell where people do experience punishment that it comes inherent in their selfish, fiery, burning hatred and desires. And there is a place in between called the world of spirits. And the teachings of the New Church have so much to say about this, and we'll talk more about that in future sermons, and you can buy the book Heaven and Hell and read it cover to cover, and you'll learn so much. It'll be great. For now, we're going to keep going with the parable and see how much more we can glean from this particular story. In the parable, the rich man cries out to Abraham from hell and first asks Abraham to send Lazarus to dip his finger in water and cool the rich man's tongue. But Abraham says this can't happen. And we might think, well, why not? Don't the angels care for the people in hell? Wouldn't they want to ease their suffering even a little bit? And the teachings of the New Church reveal what's going on here, because the symbolism of the rich man wanting water is actually a bad thing. It says that, one passage says, it means his thirst and eagerness to pervert the truths that are in the word. This is why he's not allowed to have access to water. Evil spirits in hell are not allowed to have access to the truth because they want it so they can misuse it to hurt people. And so no, rich man, you can't have the water. You can't keep using the truth that you were given to hurt other people. After death, the truth is taken away from evil people so they can't use it as a weapon against the good. And Abraham also explains that between heaven and hell is a great chasm. The state of evil spirits in hell is extremely far away from the state of angels in heaven. And a person can't just travel from one to the other. It's our hearts that locate us in the spiritual world, and we can't just change our hearts out of nowhere. Now, after his first request is denied, the rich man asks that Lazarus be sent to his father's house to tell his 5 brothers to repent so that they don't also end up in torment. And Abraham replies, "They have Moses and the prophets. Let them hear them." And the rich man insists that if someone from the dead were to talk to them, they would repent. But Abraham says, "If they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded if someone rose again from the dead." And the teachings of the new church explain that if someone rose from the dead and talked to us, we might be convinced for a short time, but it also would deprive us of our rational function, almost taking our freedom away. It would, and also ultimately would not make a lasting good impact on our lives, and would mess up a bunch of stuff within us. So, if you're looking for ways to learn about our spiritual reality, contacting dead people is not the way to do it. Now, if you've been around the new church for a little while, you might be asking, well, what about Emanuel Swedenborg then? He talked to people who died, angels and evil spirits. He came back and talked to us. Why was that allowed? How is that different? Well, I think we can just sort of picture the two experiences. Imagine if your grandmother died and then from beyond the grave came back, appeared to you, and spoke to you about life after death. That might be quite terrifying, and you would not exactly feel as though you had freedom to believe or not believe what you wanted about life after death. It would kind of force the issue. Contrast that with reading a book from the 1700s. This is not a terrifying experience. This is not an experience that takes away your freedom. It, in fact, encourages your rational mind to engage and really think about it. And really, in a lot of ways, what these books written down by Swedenborg do is point you back to Moses and the prophets. Now, if you tell someone who's feeling a little doubtful about life after death, well, just go read the Word, that might feel to them like a bit of a cop-out. Well, like, come on, if you want me to believe this stuff, just have someone appear, and then I'll believe, and it'll be simple. But if you can't make that happen, then is it actually true? But the interesting reality is that when we read Moses and the prophets, we are actually having a chance to connect with people who have died. Swedenborg writes this about his experience, and it's an experience that we all can have. He says, "Whenever I have read the word in its literal sense, a communication with the heavens has occurred, now with one society of them, now with another, and that what I have understood in accordance with a natural sense, spiritual angels have understood in accordance with its spiritual sense, and celestial angels in accordance with its celestial sense, and this in an instant." This happens for us too. As we read a story from the Lord's Word, there are spiritual angels with us understanding it at a spiritual level, and celestial angels understanding it at a celestial level. And this has been happening as we've been talking about this parable. I don't know where they are, but there's a particular society in heaven who loves this story of the rich man and Lazarus, and they've been hanging out with us, understanding it far more than we do as we go through it. Now, as for the rich man and his 5 brothers, they had the Word, and yet seemed to know nothing about life after death and the consequences that they might experience after death for their lives as they were living them in this world, even though they had angels with them as they read the Word. Or maybe they knew those ideas, but never really took them to heart, and certainly never took them to heart enough to change their behavior. Similarly, we have Moses and the prophets and all this other knowledge. Will we take the time to learn it? Will we take it to heart? Will it be enough to change our behavior? Well, let's recap some of what we've covered today. Using this parable, we've learned a few things about our spiritual reality. We've also explored how we can learn more about our spiritual reality. Working through this parable as a test case of where there's literal language that can be containers for the deeper reality. We've learned that talking to dead people is not a good method. And we've learned how reading the Word can connect us with the angels at all different levels to help us be enlightened. And we've hopefully also gained a sense for our responsibility to use what we have, At minimum, we'd better listen to Moses and the prophets telling us to obey the commandments and treat other people with generosity and kindness. And hopefully that can also motivate us to look for those people at our gates, those spiritually hungry people in our lives with whom we can share this incredible wealth we have. As a final concluding thought and a lead in to Holy Supper, it's worth realizing that all the wealth and food that the rich man had actually belonged to the Lord. And so he gets to decide who has a right to it. Those Lazarus parts of you might not be invited to the selfish rich man's table, but they certainly are invited to the Lord's table. He wants to feed you. He wants to heal you. He wants to teach you about spiritual reality. And he wants to invite you to his home so that he can teach you how to do this for other people too. Amen.